Games Workshop tell a wee fib with every single release. Every single one. How? Well, they pretend that their entire product line is created by ancient mariners. These sad, faceless figures that died so long ago that in their anguish they have forgotten their very names and instead collectively go by the signature, the Games Workshop Design Studio. Because yes, Games Workshop refused to credit their artists, their writers, their designers, all of their creatives. On all their products, you will find no mention of who created what, who sculpted which models, and who drew what art. Hell, who designed which games? And this has been going on for some time, but it has recently come to the attention of the Magic the Gathering community who aren't used to artists getting thrown under the bus in this fashion. The new Magic the Gathering Warhammer 40k sets are currently being previewed, and people are noticing that a bunch of these cards are not crediting the artists of the card art. Instead of the illustrator's name that usually shows up at the bottom of every Magic card, these cards come with Games Workshop credited as the artist. This is exceptional. Most other Magic the Gathering card sets credit artists who create the card art, as you would expect in normal land, but Games Workshop artists for some reason are special. Now I get it, sometimes it can be hard to credit artists. There's a lot of art out there, a lot of it reposted. You Google search for an image of Daddy Dom Donald Duck and you don't know who made it. It's been rehosted on some image site. It could be the greatest rendition of file-based bondage play in the world, but you would never know the artist. However, Games Workshop has no such excuse. They are commissioning the art. If they want a picture of a Daddy Dom Donald Duck, then they walk down the hall and get it. They know the name of the artist. They employ them. At least until they get rid of all their artists and replace them with machines. AI, it's the future. And I'm kind of already convinced that the design team has been replaced by AI. I will not be fooled. No human wrote this. But why do they do this? Why do they not credit any of their creatives in their rule books, their codices, their official art websites, or in front of the big, massive bundle boxes? Why is this Games Workshop's policy to obfuscate who made what? Because it seems to be the decision-making of a company run by Skeletor. Well, there's a couple of possible explanations, most of which I think are wrong. In fact, the one that I really think is true is the explanation that I've never seen anybody mention before. So today, I'm going to share the earth-shaking truth with you. And yes, I've even sleuthed out some evidence and done a little bit of research, so let's get into it. But first, let's talk about the explanations that often get bandied about the internet, like that image of Prince Harry dressed as a Nazi. Because I think they're wrong. The first is harassment. And that is not a call to action, thank you very much. This is frequently the explanation given when anyone brings this topic up. There's Reddit threads, Twitter threads, spider webs, all speculating that Games Workshop keeps their creatives anonymous in order to protect them from the big bad community. And often, the experience of Matt Ward is used as an example of the tipping point that forced Games Workshop's hand. And if you've never heard of him before, Matt Ward was a prolific designer and writer for Games Workshop until he left in 2014, and he is super famous in the community, mostly for being controversial. Was he making outrageous thumbnails? Well, no. He was the co-author of the 5th edition rulebook for 40k, the 2008 Space Marines Codex, which was really the Ultramarines Codex, the 2010 Blood Angels Codex, and the very broken 2011 Grey Knights Codex, as well as many, many more. He has dozens of credits to his name, and a lot of his decisions were controversial, to say the least. For example, there was the Blood Tide incident where the Grey Knights killed a bunch of Sisters of Battle to wear their skins as holy meat suits. Or that time he based the entire Space Marine Codex on the Ultramarines and sincerely claimed that the Ultramarines were the best Space Marine chapter. And that's why he created multiple Ultramarine-only special characters in that codex. His Demons of Chaos Codex for 7th edition Warhammer Fantasy was probably the most broken faction in all of Warhammer's history. And a new edition of Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition had to be created in order to mitigate the harm that army caused to the entire game. He was hated by a lot of people in the Warhammer community. And this resulted in a ton of harassment and hate towards him. Now that said, most of the controversial decisions of Matt Ward were in reality probably decisions made by Games Workshop directly rather than being solely decided by him. And he was just the face of the design studio, so he got all of the vitriol. And it's his experience with the hate campaigns that sprung up about him that people now point to as the rationale for why Games Workshop no longer credit their creatives. But this argument doesn't make any sense, and it lets Games Workshop off the hook. I can see no link between Matt Ward's experience and Games Workshop's decision to no longer credit any of their creative teams. For one, his experience was relatively unique. Sure, he was getting a lot of hate, but how many sculptors had ever gotten death threats before? Was Kev Goblin Master Adams getting harassed because his sculpted squigs were too cute? No, he wasn't. But yet sculptors don't get credited either. No artists were ever harassed, but they don't get credited. If there was a single designer that was the impetus for this no credit policy, then why did Games Workshop stop crediting everyone and every single creative role? And if this was the rationale to create such a policy, then why was it so hated by the creative teams? This was not something they had asked for. No one that was actually captured by this policy wanted it. And it's not like Games Workshop owed some paternal duty of care to their employees beyond simply removing their names from their work if requested. Besides, there was a less controversial way of solving this problem. Games Workshop could have let their creatives use pen names. In fact, Games Workshop did. This was something that had been done by Games Workshop even before the implementation of the no credit policy. Kim Newman, for example, wrote the Vampire Genevieve books under the pen name Jack Yobel, and there's a load more examples. So, I don't buy this one. I've never seen any actual evidence to suggest that it's true, beyond just urban legend and rumors, which, to be honest, isn't enough for me. Using a pseudonym for writers and designers would have been a much easier option to implement, because writers and designers would have been much more supportive of it than they were about completely removing credits altogether. And it would have achieved the exact same goal, yet would have continued to allow these creatives to be credited for their work and have a portfolio that they could take ownership of and point to as their own. Ah-ha-ha! And that leads to our next potential explanation for the no credit policy. Could it be that Games Workshop simply don't want their creatives to have a portfolio, to have the ability to show their work to future employees, or to help them build star power, which is like wind power, but terrifying and cosmic? If you've followed Games Workshop for a while, the 90s, then you know they used to have a ton of nerd rock stars working for them. The term nerd rock star feels like an oxymoron, but stick with me here. The Games Workshop studio had tons of big personalities in the 80s, 90s, and aughts. Perry Brothers, Rick Priestley, Gav Thorpe, John Blanche, Kev Adams, even Matt Ward. Creatives were famous and people were fans of specific creatives. The only real comparison to today are the Warhammer Plus presenters. People who are front-facing and, well, credited by Games Workshop. And many of these creatives that were famous have gone on to create their own studios, and they became competition for Games Workshop in the last few decades. So was the decision made to stop crediting creatives in order to prevent the accumulation of fame by individual creatives, and therefore potentially prevent future competition? Well, I find this answer more compelling than the idea that Games Workshop are trying to protect creatives from harassment. But I think that this element is more of a fringe benefit rather than being the central reason for the policy in the first place. And I say this because of the timing of the change. If a no credit policy were enacted in order to no longer credit creatives because Games Workshop were fed up with famous employees jetting off from the company and setting up their own competitors, then you'd think that there was some high-level occurrence of that around the time that the policy was put in place. But most of the losses of big personalities didn't really happen around that time. Famously, Games Workshop designer Rick Priestley had left in 2009. Alessio Cavatore had left in 2008 and went on to design Kings of War. The Perry brothers, probably Games Workshop's most famous sculptors, didn't leave until 2014. But the policy to stop crediting creatives and pull everything under the credit of the Games Workshop design studio occurred in 2012. And in 2012, there's no inciting incident, no big personality that might have triggered the policy, at least as far as I have been able to dig up. And while I do think that the inability of creative employees to gather a following of their own is a cruel benefit to Games Workshop, I have seen nothing to suggest that this is the central rationale of the policy. And why? Well, partly because Games Workshop creatives are allowed a social media presence, which I think would actually be banned if Games Workshop really wanted it. And Games Workshop has always, and continues to, bleed creative talent all the time to other studios. And creatives continue, to this very day, to create their own studios in competition with Games Workshop. For example, James Hewitt and Sophie Williams created Needy Cat Games in 2017, and they are both ex-Games Workshop designers. This policy, in practice, hasn't stopped people from creating competition for Games Workshop. Sure, it has maybe blunted the competition a little, but not enough, I think, to upset your creatives about. Besides, losing a lot of the rockstar talent like Perry Brothers or Priestley didn't really hurt Games Workshop that much. Sure, it's nice for Warlord Games to say that Priestley designed Bolt Action, but that's not particularly damaging to Warhammer 40k, because Games Workshop don't compete on the merit of their game design. And it's not just game designers, sculptors, and writers who don't get credited by Games Workshop. It's illustrators as well. And illustrators being famous don't present a risk to Games Workshop at all, beyond just giving those illustrators space to negotiate for better pay. And illustrators being famous and working on your products are actually kind of good for your company. It allows you to drum up interest and is so useful in marketing. That would be an actual draw and get potentially a lot more sales. So why would illustrators be anonymized if trying to prevent future competition was the main rationale? It doesn't really make any sense to me. And interestingly, while the no credit policy today anonymizes every single creative, when it was first enacted, it didn't apply to everybody equally. In fact, for a while, the policy seemed to be that only certain creative employee categories weren't to be credited. To show you what I mean, let's look at White Dwarf, Games Workshop's monthly magazine. White Dwarf used to have a big list in the front of the magazine of all the creative contributors to Citadel and Games Workshop, including artists, designers, sculptors, writers, and the famous heavy metal painting and hobby team. And in the September 2012 edition of White Dwarf, that list is indeed here, just as usual. However, in the very next edition, things have changed. In the October 2012 issue, inexplicably, a lot of those people are no longer credited. Uh-oh! It looks like Games Workshop's no credit policy has been put into force. And that is the case. It is around this time that the no credit policy does get put into effect. However, in White Dwarf, importantly, many people are still credited at this time. We can still see that the painters and hobby team are still listed and credited, but the sculptors, designers, and artists specifically aren't. And this is really curious, right? What is special about sculptors, designers, and artists? What makes them different from the Games Workshop heavy metal painting team? Is there something special about sculptors, designers, and artists that would lead Games Workshop to not want to credit them in particular? Well, yes is the answer, and it's nothing to do with harassment or minimizing the impact of when a famous creative leaves Games Workshop. Rather, it has everything to do with Chapter House. Oh yeah, we're going there. So, Chapter House. You might not know what this is, and that is probably because I have not yet released my massive retrospective and deep dive into this topic. But that will be forthcoming, so subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified of when that comes out. But put very simply, Chapter House is a notorious court case where Games Workshop took the indie miniatures company Chapter House Studios to trial over what Games Workshop alleged were copyright infringements. And this trial started in 2010. It went on for a few years, and then the summary judgment was released in 2012. Oh yeah, and 2012 is a very relevant year for us. 2012 was the year that the no credit policy was enacted by Games Workshop. Ha ha! And there was a lot to the Chapter House trial that I'm not going to go into here, but one of the things the Games Workshop alleged during it was that Chapter House had been copying sculpt designs that belonged to Games Workshop, the company. Open and shut case, you'd think. You look at the Chapter House mini, you look at the Games Workshop mini. Is it the same? Boom! You got a result. But, as these things often do, it became a lot more complicated in the courtroom. Because when Games Workshop made this claim in court, Chapter House had a pretty wild response. And that was, Games Workshop cannot claim copyright infringement of many of their designs because Games Workshop don't own the rights to those designs. Woo! Okay, big claim. Obviously absurd. Right? Right? Well, that's where this gets juicy. The reason Chapter House were claiming this was because the miniature designs in question had been created by freelancers, not employees. And this is really important because everything an employee makes in the pursuit of their employment belongs to their employer. Freelancers, however, by default own the copyright to everything they create, not their contractor, in this case, Games Workshop, unless there is an explicit agreement in their contract to the contrary. And suddenly, the employment status of Games Workshop creatives involved in the creation of art, sculpts, miniatures, and designs was a central question during this trial. Exactly the category of creatives who were the first to go uncredited in that 2012 October issue of White Dwarf. And it was well publicized who had created what at Games Workshop through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s because Games Workshop were crediting all their creatives at the time, which meant Chapter House was able to pinpoint which designs had been made by which employees, and therefore which ones had not. And this allowed them to create a list of Games Workshop miniatures that Chapter House alleged did not belong to Games Workshop at all, but to freelancers. And in court, Games Workshop panicked. and they acquiesced to Chapter House and stopped pursuing their claims over those specific models that the rights had been identified by Chapter House as not belonging to Games Workshop, which was around like 90 entries. The only ones Games Workshop contested were the ones they could demonstrate and prove were made explicitly by employees. And this was a huge problem for Games Workshop. It became a massive deal during the Chapter House trial, and it's obvious the Games Workshop were very uncomfortable having the issue of who owned the copyright to their models being brought up in a courtroom and actually get examined by lawyers with a critical eye. And this experience, in my opinion, is the definitive reason why Games Workshop no longer credit their creatives, and instead credit everything they produce as coming from the Games Workshop Design Studio. This credit style obfuscates what work is done by whom, and it solidifies Games Workshop's hold over the copyright of the work that they produce. It means that if Games Workshop ever go to trial again, perhaps to enforce their copyright or trademark terms against, say, I don't know, 3D STL print hosting website, that company can't turn around and say, well, Games Workshop, actually, you don't own the copyright to so many of your models. You can't enforce those claims. They actually belong to Des Hanley. Which is a scenario that actually happened in the Chapter House trial. You see, when you credit everything to a design studio, who knows who made what? Any evidence brought up in a courtroom would be hearsay.
Well, Your Honor, we've got plenty of hearsay and conjecture. Those are kinds of evidence.
In the Chapter House trial, there were questions involving very minute details about Games Workshop's designs. It wasn't just a case of, who made the Rhino vehicle? It was also, who designed the Blood Angels icon? Or the Evil Sun's sigil? Games Workshop never want to be talking about that stuff, and they never want to be at risk of being stripped of elements of their IP in a courtroom based on which creatives created what. So there you have it. That's why Games Workshop don't credit their creatives. And it sucks. Let's be under no illusions here. This is a really bad policy. Creatives deserve to be credited. It's incredibly hypocritical for a company like Games Workshop that jealously guards the sanctity of its products on the one hand, to then on the other refuse to acknowledge the actual real-life people who made it. And it does hurt creatives quite a lot, actually, because now very few people outside of Games Workshop know who they are. And that sucks because you probably love a lot of their work and don't even know it. Artists like Thomas Elliott, Lewis Jones, Phil Moss, and way more. Far too many to list here. All of them have contributed to books, codices, and other Games Workshop materials, and yet you'd never know. But because Games Workshop are the biggest miniature wargame company and a huge tabletop company, they know they are able to take advantage of creatives in this industry. And that's not fair. Games Workshop should change their policy. It's better for the industry because when they are credited, creatives gain a demonstrable portfolio of work that they can show to future employers and be proud of. Consumers can find out who their favorite artists and designers are and follow their work. And creatives can build platforms for themselves that they can use to negotiate for better pay and even monetize, allowing them to sustainably earn a living in this incredibly niche and competitive market. It's better for the industry, it's better for me and you, it's better for everybody if creatives are credited for what they produce. Get rid of the Games Workshop Design Studio and tell us who the real life people are who make the stuff that we love. And really, it's the bare minimum. It's just the decent, ethical thing to do. And I'm just happy that I'm able to shine a light on that topic today. I'm gonna be honest, this video took a ton of research. That's why it's out a couple of days later than usual. It was a load of work and was really hard to make. There's very little documentation out there on a lot of this stuff. It's hard to find. Took a ton of sleuthing, a lot of sleuthing, read a couple of the old court documents, got some use out of my Westlaw before it expires. And it's only thanks to my patrons that have enabled me to pursue content creation full time that has allowed me to investigate this topic to the extent that I did and get what I think is the definitive answer to an age-old question in the community. So if you feel like this video presented value, please do consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/discourseminiatures, where you can get special live streams, ad-free content, and maybe in future some game sessions in. Thanks. And once the Chapter House video is out, I'll link it here. And as always, a huge thanks to all my patrons. Thank you so much, especially Sonic Bread and Beauregard Quitman, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!